All right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out today. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Naomi Schaefer-Riley. Welcome to those of you who are in the room with us today and for those of you joining us online. I am a senior fellow here at AEI, focusing on the area of child welfare. Here at AEI, we are devoted to finding solutions to help the most vulnerable members of our society, and there are few more vulnerable than the children who are our focus today. So let me tell you about two of them. The first is Jelia Eason. You may have heard about her last year. She was only 6 years old when police found her not breathing inside a closet in her apartment. She died of asphyxia and blunt force injuries. Neighbors reported that she was screaming for her life the previous evening. The family had had several visits from authorities related to domestic violence in the home over the years leading up to this fatal incident. The conditions inside the home at the time were found to be filthy and vermin-infested. Jelia's mother was just arrested last week, and so her name is back in the news. The other story I want to tell you is about a 13-month-old whose name we may never know. In fact, we don't even know if it's a boy or a girl. This baby is one of 3 infants treated for fentanyl ingestion in separate incidents on just one day in the state of Washington last month. The other 2 survived, but he or she did not. All over the country, we are seeing a rise in pediatric poisonings and unsafe sleep deaths involving parental intoxication. Many of them are recorded as accidents, and the public is often not informed or underinformed. Some deaths that result from abuse and neglect get attention briefly and then fade away. Some never get any attention at all. At least 2,000 children die from maltreatment in this country every year. The official number of maltreatment deaths provided by the federal government has been rising steadily. But as you will hear today, there are a variety of reasons that most experts believe this is an undercount. Regardless, this issue receives very little attention in the media, and certainly not in the sustained way that it deserves. Our new website, which is live now, livescutshort.org, and the Candid database that is housed on it could not come at a more important time. Many local media outlets and legislators are waking up to the impact of the drug epidemic on children. Unfortunately, they have no context for understanding these deaths, how often they occur, where they are concentrated, whether they could have been prevented, and what state agencies and the rest of us could be doing differently. At the same time, there seems to be decreasing interest in the child welfare community in understanding what is going on. When I bring up child maltreatment fatalities at tables with professionals in this space, I am often told that talking about these deaths is, quote, letting the tail wag the dog, that we can't make policy or even think about policy based on such small numbers and such rare incidents. First, of course, I don't think those numbers are small at all. They certainly dwarf gun fatalities for young children. They far surpass mass shootings in schools, but we have no shortage of conversations about those tragedies. Second, child maltreatment fatalities are the part of the iceberg we can see. How much more suffering do they represent? I am only a few years into the field of child welfare, having spent most of my career as a journalist. But I've been fortunate to find some incredibly smart and thoughtful colleagues, and you will get to hear from a number of them this morning, including members of the Board of Advisors of Lives Cut Short. But first, I'd like to recognize Marie Cohen, the program director, who is the author of the Child Welfare Monitor blog that I commend to all of you. And she is the author of the important paper that describes much of the reason behind this work. You can find a PDF of this paper on the event's webpage, as well as on the Lives Cut Short website. We also have had a number of volunteers helping with going through some of this data, and some of them are joining us here today. The principal investigators for this project are Emily Putnam Hornstein, the John Tate Distinguished Professor for Children in Need at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Sarah Font, Associate Professor of Sociology and Public Policy at Penn State. After Emily goes into more detail about the project and shows you the website, which is now live again at livescutshort.org, I will host a panel with Sarah, as well as 3 members of our Board of Advisors. They are Antonio Garcia, Buckhorn Professor of Social Work at the University of Kentucky, John Mattingly, who was former Commissioner of New York City's Administration for Children's Services, and Viola Von Eden, Professor at the Ethelyn R. Strong School of Social Work at Norfolk State University. After the panel, we will have plenty of time for questions from the audience here, as well as those watching virtually. If you are watching online and want to ask a question, please tweet it to us at #LivesCutShortAEI, or email it to abigail.wallen, W-A-L-L-E-N, @aei.org. Finally, I would like to mention that we are honored to have relatives of some of the victims of these tragedies with us here today. I'd like to ask them to stand to thank them for being a voice for the voiceless today. Thank you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emily.
Childhood is meant to be a time of endless possibilities. A time when children are free to explore the world around them, safe in the knowledge that they are loved, nurtured, and protected. But what happens when that trust is betrayed? When their lives are cut short? Shouldn't we know their names? Shouldn't we know their stories? Each year, at least 2,000 children die of maltreatment, many of whom go unnamed, with an unknown number uncounted altogether. Some are chronically beaten or sexually abused prior to their death. Many others are casualties of unstable home environments, often involving caregivers with severe mental illness, family violence, or untreated addiction. Worse still, many of these circumstances were known to child welfare, law enforcement, social services, or medical professionals before the fatal incident occurred. Too often, the government fails to accurately record these deaths or to release information that would help determine their causes. Our efforts seek to end this cycle through the establishment of a public database that records information on child fatalities due to maltreatment. Only with an accurate count and clear description of the circumstances that led to these tragedies can we begin to better prevent them. No more lives cut short.
Good morning. Now that you've seen the video and heard from Naomi, I want to tell you a little bit more about the decedents who are reflected in this database. I initially thought maybe I would kind of click around and walk everyone through, but the site is live, so I'd rather just stand here today and tell you a little bit about our process and why we have pursued this. So first, all records that are available in what we're calling CANDID, which is the Child Abuse and Neglect Integrated Data System, were generated from publicly available sources. This includes media articles, existing death archives, such as the Gun Violence Archive, the Disability Day of Mourning Archive, the U.S. Child Murder and Divorce Archive. We've also integrated state-issued fatality case reports and county medical examiner records. For each record, we have included one or more of the sources that we have identified to date. In situations where a child died in a state that releases additional information about child fatalities, such as Florida and Arizona, we have cross-referenced those media articles we identified with more detailed summaries to both provide greater context for the child's death and to ensure that we have an unduplicated set of cases in the data. We continue to update the listings as older media reports are identified and as new media coverage emerges, and we continue to input existing and new state notifications, and reviews. I will say there's often such a lag to any coverage or recognition of these deaths that even though we are now in 2024, I think just about every day we're coming across some new piece of information concerning a child who died in 2022. As recently as last night, I was looking at records where even though the child had died in 2022, the agency indicated it was still waiting for autopsy and toxicology reports more than kind of many months later. In terms of how we have defined a child who has died due to abuse or neglect, broadly, we have decided to rely on the definition that guides those records that appear in our official statistics. So we rely on the National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System definition of maltreatment, in which they describe the death of a child as resulting from maltreatment because either an injury was the result of abuse or neglect, and that was the cause of death, or abuse or neglect were contributing factors to the cause of death. Understandably, given our reliance on media coverage to identify children who died of maltreatment, most cases we came across required very little review. The media, as we know, is more likely to cover deaths in which the manner was classified as a homicide or where there was an arrest of a parent or a caretaker. But we've also gone to great lengths to glean from states that are more kind of forthcoming with fatality summaries, information about cases that may receive no media coverage, but where we feel confident based on the information that is shared, that that is not a case that already appears in our data. We're starting with this initial public release of information on 2,000 children who've died of abuse or neglect since 2022. In some cases, such as a little boy by the name of Bryson, who was 5 years old when he was killed by his mother's boyfriend in Florida, we have multiple media articles and a detailed fatality review from the state. In other cases, such as Delilah from California, we simply know from a medical examiner report that she died of meth exposure at the age of 1, and her death was classified as an accident. There was no media coverage, and I strongly doubt that her death is reflected in any official statistics of maltreatment. But as Naomi mentioned, for many other children, we don't even know their names, such as the 2-year-old who died of blunt force trauma in Illinois, having been admitted a month earlier in critical condition, bruised, scarred, with new and old fractures. We are still in the process of adding many more decedents and records that we identify from 2022 and 2023, and we are actively tracking and incorporating coverage of children who've died in 2024. So the kind of main part of the site is a list where you are able to go in and read about these deaths. You will also find on our site information about each state. How many child maltreatment deaths were recorded in the official statistics in NCANS for 2022, how many children have died in that state according to official statistics in the last 10 years, and how many children we currently have information for in Candid. We provide a description of why both of those numbers are undercounts. We additionally provide information about each state's statutes for reporting maltreatment fatalities, notifying the public when deaths occur, and releasing information. Our goal is to help surface just how different states are when reporting this information, not because we think that states are doing something good or bad, Frankly, many of the states that have higher numbers of deaths reflected in our database, it reflects that they have been and are being that much more transparent. But it's really interesting because frequently we hear that it's kind of federal prohibitions on confidentiality and what can be reported. And when you look across these states, you see that a lot of this does come down to what a state chooses to share with the public. I want to kind of underscore that this is just an initial launch. We realized that we could spend many, many years reviewing each and every case, looking for each and every media article, reaching out to try to obtain redacted records of system involvement. But we felt strongly that some of these conversations around child deaths and child safety need to start now. So we've launched with these cases, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the next steps in terms of the data we hope to continue gathering. First, we plan to obtain medical examiner reports from our largest counties. We have not started that yet. At this point, the medical examiner reports you will see are those where they were already publicly available and we had the time to go in and look. We plan to do much deeper dives into many of these cases. For these 2,000 children, we plan to enter as much information as we can into a database so that we better understand the full context of their system involvement, if any, as well as the other risk factors that's emerged. We plan to produce additional filters. Right now, you can go into our database and publicly sort by state and child age. As we continue to classify each of these deaths, that will be available to the public. We also plan to move towards, we've done a fairly kind of manual initial identification and review as to how we have searched for and identified these cases. We plan to become much more systemic in that. And finally, we plan to reach out and work with states to identify if there are materials we have not seen. We're also very, very eager for other ideas on data sources that are public and then we can use. Before I turn this kind of back over to Naomi and the panel joins us on stage, I just wanted to take a moment to mention kind of my why in this project. And reality is these are incredibly tragic situations, but I believe strongly that the public should know the names and the stories of children who have been killed. It is too easy to look away, and when we look away, our systems don't improve. I also, and as an extension of that, truly believe that these child deaths emerge and reflect broader fundamental problems on the part of our many government systems, and that those problems compromise the safety of many more children. Finally, I simply cannot see any reason that we are not able to adopt a more consistent standard for documenting maltreatment deaths and accountability for their reporting. We are almost 10 years out from the establishment of the Commission to Eliminate Child Abuse and Neglect Fatalities. And while there was great fanfare and interest at that time, I have seen very, very little action since. And as I look at the data and reflect on the fact that since 2013, there's been an almost 30% increase in child abuse and neglect fatalities as reported in NCANs, the truth is, I can't stand here as a researcher and tell you that is a real increase, versus that is an increase because states are doing a better job tracking. This information is important, and if we're going to start assessing whether or not we are protecting children properly, we need to have an accurate count. Thank you.
All right, we're going to bring our panelists up on stage. If you can join me here, we're going to have a little discussion about all this. All right, thanks, everyone. So I wanted to start with you, Sarah. Sarah's, as I mentioned, one of the two principal investigators on the project. As Emily mentioned, we have had attempts to count these numbers before. There have been national commissions, states have certainly tried to look into it. Can you talk a little bit about the history of attempts to quantify this problem and why it is that they haven't lived up to what our expectations have been?
Sure. So there's a couple of different data sources that have been used to try to characterize child maltreatment fatalities. The main one, which Emily and Naomi both mentioned, is the NCANS count. And so that's an annual report released by the federal government that includes things like how many children were referred to Child Protective Services, and it also includes a count of child maltreatment fatalities. And that is the number that most people cite to say that child maltreatment deaths are rare. There's many problems with those data. One is that states get to decide which cases they even investigate to consider as a possible fatality. So for example, some states are primarily investigating cases where the manner of death is labeled a homicide, whereas other states are looking at all deaths that are considered unnatural. Because a lot of the deaths for things like fentanyl poisoning or children killed in drunk driving accidents with their parents, those are not cases that would necessarily be coded as a homicide. They could be coded as an accident. They could be coded as undetermined. So many of those end up not being counted. Another factor in the NCANS count is that states may not investigate through child protection a fatality where there's no surviving siblings or where the perpetrator is deceased, such as a murder-suicide. And so those cases, too, do not end up in our official counts. And the other problem is that their process is often very delayed. So especially during COVID, states were reporting very small death numbers because they hadn't actually finished investigating many of them. The last thing I want to know about that is that state practices really matter here. So, for example, the state recorded in NCANS with the highest child maltreatment fatality rate is Mississippi. And theirs is something like 10 per 100,000 children. Now, you might think that Mississippi has an above average rate of child maltreatment fatalities, but do we really believe it's 3 to 4 times higher than Louisiana or Alabama? I don't think so. There's no reason to really think that's true. So what's different about Mississippi? Well, one of the things that they reported is that their fatality count went up when they started reporting cases where the manner of death wasn't labeled a homicide, but maltreatment was determined to be a contributing factor to the death. Another thing they started doing was having specially trained, dedicated teams that investigate child fatalities. So when you do a better job of investigating and you report a broader share of the deaths, your counts are going to go up. So again, the states that have the really, what appear to be high fatality counts might be the states doing the best to uncover those deaths and understand them. And we should encourage that level of transparency and effort to understand the deaths. The other data source that sometimes is used is the Center for Disease Control child homicide statistics. But again, as I mentioned, many of those deaths that are caused by things like drug overdoses are going to be mislabeled in those data. So in short, we have no national data source that is going to tell us how many children die from maltreatment each year or the ways in which they die. So we can't learn from these deaths in the way we need to prevent them going forward.
Thanks, sir. So we're going to sort of go back and have a kind of conversation with all the panelists together. I just want to remind you, if you're watching online and have questions, we're going to be taking questions in a little while. You can tweet them to us at #LiveCutShort AEI, or email them to abigail.wallen, WALLEN, @aei.org. I want to turn to John Mattingly. We're lucky to have with us a former commissioner of New York City's Child Welfare Agency. John, can you describe sort of the role that child fatalities play in policy, and why it is important as the head of an agency to get an accurate count of these, and maybe even to be able to compare your counts with what's going on in other geographical areas?
Good morning, everybody. I've been doing child protection work for over 30 years. I spent 10 years working with New York City and 7 years as their commissioner. I spent 6 years running Northwest Ohio's Child Protection Agency, and for 10 years I worked for the Annie E. Casey Foundation as the head of the Family to Family initiative, which gave me access to the experience of child protective agencies clear across the country. This is a fairly simple question to me. I found that while I learned from all of our mistakes, I also learned from our success cases. But when it came to a child death, that's what took the most work to determine exactly what it was in our system that kept us from being able to protect the child who ended up dead. What it is in our system that kept us from intervening, either because we didn't have enough workers. There is no free lunch in this business. If you don't have enough trained, capable, supervised workers out in the field, you can't do the work. We learned also, however, that there are systemic matters within how the agency functions, within how the agency decides which kids to remove and which kids to work with in their home. Those systemic issues are borne out when we look carefully at a child death where we've dropped the ball in many cases and in many ways. For example, we had a child die who we virtually knew nothing about because she had been returned to her family, or really placed with her family for the first time at the age of 3, even though she was profoundly needy. And that nobody at the nursing home even considered the possibility of contacting us to take under concern that child's case. And we missed her. And there were system issues within the agency by which we could have caught her, but we didn't. So I'm talking primarily here about learning. Agencies need to learn from their mistakes and from the experiences of others, good, bad, or indifferent, around the country. And this is a matter of simple, straightforward policy that I don't think we need to disagree on, but that is a straightforward matter of our intervening with this database as a beginning effort, so that we can begin to learn from one another what's working and what's not.
Thanks, John. Viola, I wanted to sort of ask you, you've been an expert witness in many of these cases, and in your clinical experience, you're obviously very familiar with the risk factors that are contributing to these tragedies. Can you describe a little bit about what's going on in some of these families, how we should put these deaths into context? I mean, Emily and I have both talked a little bit about the problems of drug use in some of these areas, but also family violence. Tell us what you're seeing on the ground, because I think we've been talking at 30,000 feet here, and maybe you can kind of bring us back down to what's really going on in these families.
Okay. So I have been practicing as a clinical social worker for almost a little over 30 years. And I started out working in psychiatric facilities with children wondering why so many of them had been hospitalized. I think the real challenge that I failed early on to appreciate, and it actually took me a dissertation to figure it out, just had to do with our focus on the child and not understanding that I may be, or the social worker, CPS worker may be with that child 1 hour a week, but the family is with that child the other 167 hours in that week. And being so myopically focused on the child, we fail to recognize or appreciate the need to educate and support the family. So I don't want it to take a dissertation to get there like it did for me, but recognizing that if we don't kind of practice social work 101, meaning if we don't look at what the needs are of the family, if we don't educate, support, get them the resources that they need, help them, whether it's employment, many of them live in food deserts, and many of them are suffering with intergenerational recidivism. Ultimately, my work around non-offending caregivers had to do with the fact that they themselves had suffered abuse in their own childhood and had not received treatment, and then they're trying to parent without the skills and without the resources. So I think we have to kind of look at it, even though I'm a practitioner, we still have to put that spectrum of prevention around this, meaning look at, even as a clinician, I have to appreciate what policies are impacting these families, what services might they need that are beyond maybe my realm of treatment. And ultimately, we kind of call that moving upstream, recognizing that I can do that intervention 1 hour a week, but what happens for that family the rest of the time is so important. I think striking for me, I'm part of and president of a nonprofit called Up for Champions, in which we recognize professionals working with children and families, but we recognize them at the end of the year with a tree. And it was so profound what Emily and Sarah both said, is that the data is behind. So just a couple of weeks ago, we recognized the children of both Virginia and Louisiana who had died by recognizing professionals, giving them a tree. And that may sound really simple in some ways, but one of the things that I was asked to do is to give them a certificate when we give them the tree, and read the causes of death. So I had to stand there and read the causes of death of over 20 children out loud to an audience. And what was striking that I had failed to appreciate is, as you said earlier, the number of children even dying from fentanyl, heroin, and other drugs that we would not think that an infant would have access to. So how do we support families who are struggling with substance abuse? And it's not just, simple, oh, I took it off the table. As it was explained to me, is that when drugs are used in a home, oftentimes it's on the surfaces. So infants are crawling around and it's getting in through the palms of their hands and feet, and they're dying from that. So we have to recognize this problem on a larger scale. And I think last I'll say is that I am often called in to review a child's death, whether it's for social services, whether it's for attorneys or state's attorneys. This problem isn't going to get solved by us pointing fingers at each other. The only way this problem is going to get solved is us coming together, out of our silos, looking at it from developing some universal prevention avenues and addressing it in a way such as we are here today, raising the awareness, but then taking those next steps to use comprehensive approach.
Thank you. Well, that leads me, I think, very easily into my question for you, Antonio. I mean, in part, this is a conversation about, what child welfare agencies are doing, but as we've heard, there are so many other points of contact that these families often have with a state and also even private agencies, where we wonder kind of what could have happened differently. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, medical professionals or law enforcement or teachers, who it is, who we can look to, and what role other people outside of the agencies are playing here as well.
Great question. Just for context, prior to academia, I used to work as a CPS worker in Washington State. And during that time, in the 4 years I was doing that work, I came across 2 child fatality cases. These families were not known to me, but they were very much known to the system. And as I combed through those records, I quickly learned that we didn't understand the context. We didn't know who was involved, what systems were involved, what systems could have been involved. What were their support systems? How could these cases be prevented? And to your point, the child welfare system does rely upon other systems to protect kids from harm. We're dependent upon medical professionals, educators, clinicians to report suspected abuse and neglect, to know when to report, to know the signs and symptoms of trauma or abuse and neglect. And if those kids do end up in the system, child welfare workers often refer those kids to receive services, families to receive services to mitigate those risks and harms. So child welfare systems very much depend upon the community and its stakeholders and other providers across systems to monitor services, to monitor whether or not the child is improving, doing well, to make sure that those risk factors are indeed being addressed. So it takes a very holistic approach to make sure that kids are safe. And going back to those 2 cases, I still wonder to this day, there was history, but there was not much information about that history. And I think what this project does is really trying to unearth that complexity, unearth that history, so that in the future we can better identify or prevent these horrific cases from happening.
I wanted to dig a little deeper here. Something you said, Sarah, you said this the other day, and it still sticks out at me. There is some states are not, that child welfare is not, child protective services is not getting involved or investigating these fatalities if there's no other sibling in the house after the fatality. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, because it does raise questions about what incentives are in place for these different bureaucracies to investigate and to be transparent about the data, because this, Life's Cut Short, we're all about the transparency here. I mean, whatever policies we want to talk about afterwards is important, but we think the most important thing first is getting the data and information out there. So what are the things that are right now sort of guiding states in releasing this information, and do you have any thoughts on sort of changing those incentives?
Yeah, so in a sense, it doesn't make sense for child protection to investigate a fatality when there's no surviving child currently at risk. Law enforcement would be investigating those cases, but the problem is all of our data sources then are scattered, and so we bring together this NCANS number without acknowledging that it's not meaningful. And so part of, I think, the path forward to really understanding the scope and causes of these child fatalities is that the data has to be integrated across these different systems that are responsible for investigating. But there also has to be a real incentive for states to be transparent. The problem is when states report a lot of fatalities, they look bad. They might be called out by media or advocacy groups, they might be sued, and maybe those things are appropriate, but the states who are hiding that information are not facing those same pressures, and so the incentive structure is really works against transparency.
John, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that question as well. What are the incentives there for releasing or not releasing this information?
There aren't incentives to release, and that's one of the major problems. What we need to do is to incentivize the sharing of information so we can learn across systems and we can learn within our own agencies what it is that we're doing well and what not. If, for example, a child didn't have any SIBs and died, we want to know why that child died and what we could have done to have prevented that, if anything. And to close our eyes systemically to this information is, I think, a major policy decision that's a mistake.
We do seem to be moving in sort of a less transparent direction in some ways. There has been a lot of pressure, particularly in the medical profession, against certain kinds of reporting. There was news a couple of weeks ago about Mass General Hospital sort of trying to reduce the number of reports to CPS of drug-exposed infants or of drug use by new mothers. What is going on there? I don't know if Antonio Viola, you have any thoughts on kind of why there seems to be less incentive to even report risk factors, let alone fatalities?
Well, right now, there's this huge debate around whether or not the child welfare system is oppressive or healing. And so with medical professionals, I think some of the effort is around how can we better support parents to overcome their addiction and potentially prevent maltreatment. But I think that would require a lot of infrastructure support and reallocation of services and dollars to ensure that those prevention supports are in place. And right now, as we sit here, those supports are not there. And so in the interim, that puts a lot of, it jeopardizes the safety of kids in hospital settings.
Viola, I don't know if you want to.
So, I mean, I think for me, it's just something that's really basic. We, for whatever reason, are a society that's reactive instead of proactive. So ultimately, as opposed to deciding to move upstream and work more in the area of prevention, we're such a litigious society that everyone's playing hide the ball. I mean, because I don't want to be the next person sued. I don't want my hospital or my practice taken down by some mistake that someone made. I think if we could somehow shift the focus to upstream and recognizing that if we could provide the services as the support services and not just after something bad has happened, but before something bad happens and be more proactive, I think we would have a chance. But that takes a level of, I guess, courage and commitment to our society as a whole. And I don't know if we're there yet. That's where we're struggling.
Yeah.
I'll add, in addition to that, a lot of the medical professionals are not aware of any previous child welfare history. Mm-hmm. And so while they see this mother who may be grappling with addiction, they may not be aware of other risk factors, the pervasiveness of the addiction. And so information sharing is critical across systems in these cases.
I think, and I just one thing that popped in my head, I think one of the things that we fail to realize is that although we think often of child welfare workers as social workers, many child welfare workers are not trained in social work or trained in child development or anything of that nature. So some of the things that we see happening that go wrong and we go, oh, how did that go wrong? That would be basic to a social worker. It's because we have child welfare workers in our state that, or not in our state, but in our country that don't have a college education. They don't have, again, if they do have a college education, it is not in the human services, counseling, social work, child development arena. So we're asking a lot of workers to go out and make life decisions on behalf of children and families that they may not have the knowledge, skills, or resources to do. So we have to also acknowledge that piece.
Just a reminder, we're going to take questions in a few minutes. If you have questions, you can tweet them to us at #LivesCutShortAEI or email them to abigail.wallen, WALLEN, @aei.org. And we'll also take questions from folks who are here as well. Another question that has come up that I wanted to ask about is as we've gone through these cases, Sarah, I mean, it seems abundantly clear that most of these families have been known to someone before this fatal incident occurred. And I think it's kind of a popular myth out there that, because sometimes you read about a high-profile case of a child death, and they interview the neighbors, and the neighbors said, we had no idea what was going on. But most of these cases are known to someone, and someone knew that something was going wrong. And maybe Antonia, you could talk about this too. What is going wrong here? That again, maybe partly it's the incentives, but why aren't we more concerned or understand better these risks before these fatal incidents occur?
So, as we were preparing for the launch, and I was reviewing, hundreds of cases on the website, the most striking thing about it was that they weren't unique. After a while, it was very hard to remember if I had already read that case or not, because the same things appeared over and over and over again. But they're the same things that appear over and over and over again in most child protection cases. Untreated mental illness, chronic substance abuse, unstable relationships with men in the home, domestic violence, all of those things just showed up over and over and over. And so I think the problem is that it's very hard, given those risk factors, to predict whether or not a child will die. We know those risk factors can lead to death, but they might not. And so child welfare is inclined, I think, to intervene at the least intensive level possible. And I think this is hard to say, but at some point we need to acknowledge that for some set of kids, foster care is a necessary and life-saving intervention. And I think we too often shy away from that.
I think, at least in social work, again, I was a trained MSW social worker working as a CPS worker. And I literally, as I was starting out, realized that my primary role was child safety and permanency. And learned after a number of years that my job was impossible. How do you balance safety, permanency, and stability all at the same time? And if I'm struggling, I can't imagine how much providers across different systems are struggling who may not even be privy to how the child welfare system operates. So I think just a recognition that we're asked to often do the impossible. It is traumatic to remove kids from the home. It's equally traumatic to keep them in there if they're being traumatized and abused and neglected. And so what I hope going forward is that, we identify profiles or risk factors that can clue us into what may lead to a child fatality. And I think that'll be difficult because, as mentioned, as Sarah mentioned, addiction, untreated mental illness, previous history of child welfare system involvement. Those types of factors are your run-of-the-mill child abuse and neglect cases. But as mentioned, one day it could lead to a child fatality. But is there something that we should be looking out for, in terms of really trying to prevent these cases from happening? So we got our work cut out for us, I think.
So I think, and I was listening to you when you were talking, I don't think, as you said, there's going to be one risk factor that we're going to be able to identify. I think what we're going to have to do is kind of step back and make some decisions, societal decisions, that we're going to support and treat everyone and provide services for everyone and elevate our society's consciousness. And I'll just give you one example. Elevate consciousness, and Sarah knows this better than I do because this is some work that she's done as well, but change social norms around corporal punishment is one example. If we could change the social norms, and not just for the people that are spanking, but for society as a whole, then we would reduce physical abuse by at least, 30% or more? And we also know that physical abuse is often a primary cause of child fatality. And I hate using the word cause, so forgive me. But it's a major contributor to child fatalities. But if we don't work to, being from Virginia, I remember, and I've never smoked a day in my life, but we're a tobacco state. And I remember the first time I heard that we were going to tell people they couldn't smoke in restaurants, I laughed, even though I've never smoked in my life. I'm like, these people are you kidding? We're a tobacco state. People used to smoke in hospitals, doctors standing over their patients, okay? But all of a sudden, someone got the brilliant idea to put up no smoking signs. And even though it's still legal to smoke, people started being more conscious of where they were smoking. So we have to kind of take that approach of saying, we talked, and Sarah knows about like no hit zones, an area where we say, in this space, there is no violence. We don't hit, an adult doesn't hit an adult doesn't hit a child doesn't hit a child doesn't hit an adult. No one hits. The same way we said no smoking. Yes, corporal punishment in the United States is legal. It actually is legal in 17 public schools. States, but we have to raise our consciousness overall and say that no, there's never going to be one risk factor. What's for me being here, and I heard Emily say about her why, my why has to do with the fact that almost 40 years ago now, I was in school getting my degrees and starting out thinking that maybe by the time my career was over, child abuse would not still be an issue. And that's how young and naive I was at that moment. But I can say we've come a long way. The research, has taken us far and wide, but we can't look for one simple answer because this problem clearly is far more complex. So it has to do with this integration across all areas, much like the multidisciplinary team of practitioners, but instead inviting the policymakers to that multidisciplinary team, inviting the administrators of child welfare agencies to that table so that we can say it isn't just about this one family, it is about society as a whole and how we can shift our consciousness and change some norms.
Thank you.
And that reminds me about alternative response or differential response. So 25 plus states offer these alternative response entities. And basically that involves, these low risk profile cases where there's not quite enough justification to refer out for investigation, but there's some risk there. And in those cases, caseworkers may refer that family for services. We have no idea the impact of those services or what's happening as a result of those efforts. But sitting here, I'm wondering, would any of those services prevent fatalities? If we took a more prevention approach and said, here are some, low risk profile cases. There's some history there with child welfare. Can we follow up with those families more frequently to make sure that they are accessing services in the community that may mitigate those factors?
But I think what you also said, Antonio, that we have to engage community stakeholders. Yeah. So it's not one direction that child welfare workers are reaching out. We have to work to engage the faith community which is so important to so many people. We have to work to engage other community stakeholders so that they also participate in this kind of comprehensive wraparound approach.
Exactly, yeah.
One of the, just one common thread, and then I want to start with questions both from the audience and online. A lot of the names who are listed on the website, and by the way, again, the website is live now, livescutshort.org. I encourage you to go because we're going to bring Emily back up here and also do questions that you may have about the website itself. But one common thread that you see in those list of names is the number of children who are infants who have died. And I want to talk to you, Sarah, and maybe John too, about kind of what the particular risks are for babies that we're seeing, whether we need to, be just having a different level of concern about very small children, and why that seems to be such a unfortunately common outcome for these young children.
Well, I mean, infants die more easily, right? They can't run, they can't hide. They're dependent on their caregivers for every aspect of their daily existence. And so the incapacitation of their primary caregiver is going to have a much stronger and more immediate effect. So I think the primary issues with really young children, I mean, there's several, but it's the same things again, right? Substance use, mental illness, domestic violence, and there's other things like unsafe sleep, but a lot of those involve parents who are under the influence of drugs or alcohol again. And so I think part of the problem is that we grapple with wanting to treat addiction and mental illness as health problems, which they are, but that means that we want parents to always voluntarily choose to engage in treatment. And I think that would be great if that is something that can happen. But when parents don't engage in treatment and they do have these chronic problems that we know are a risk for infant safety, there's a really real reluctance to be pushy about it and to say, like, no, it's actually not safe to use fentanyl while you're parenting an infant. Like, we can't make that safe no matter how many lock boxes we put in your house. So I think we need to be better about how we engage parents and try to get them to voluntarily engage in relevant and appropriate treatment services, but we also have to acknowledge that the involvement of courts or other entities to make that happen is sometimes very necessary.
We in New York actually took a look on a one-time basis as to which were the most frequent cases which we were experiencing failure from having returned the children home and at the same time then new abuse or neglect occurring. And we determined pretty clearly that those cases were heavily weighted on young mothers with drug problems who had gone home with a relative supportive of the family. And that may well have been the right decision, but we found that those cases are particularly vulnerable. And I think we as a system need to pay a great deal of attention to those infants who are going home and then being abused and neglected again.
All right, thanks. So I just want to invite Emily to come back up, and then we are going to take some questions from the audience and from the online audience about anything we've talked about here, and also if you've had a chance to look around the website and you have questions about the site itself, we encourage you to either send a tweet to #LivesCutShortAEI or to email your question to abigail.wallen, WALLEN, @aei.org. So we'll start with some questions from the audience if we have them here. All right, right there in the back. Hold on, just wait for the mic.
Sure.
Hi. So I'm going to ask my questions first. I'm going to tell you why I'm asking them.
Okay. We don't demand that part.
Well, I know, but it might be helpful. So first of all, thank you all very much for your work. I guess the end question I'm going to end up with is, how do you do the responding to this? So this has all been about data gathering of children who've already died, right? And so how do we use this data, or how do you propose using the data to affect change without creating a massive national bureaucracy when each of you have kind of talked about the solution probably happening best at the local level, right? At the state, at the local, at the county, with local faith leaders and things like that. So how do you see this data being used that way? Because I'm guessing that was a goal. The second has to do with these closed databases, right? All of these different organizations have proprietary databases. Maybe they paid to have their database created, and so they don't want to share data. States aren't sharing data with federal authorities, county authorities. How do you do that? And I ask that because I grew up in the dark ages of child welfare. I'm an 8 on the ACEs score. I have all of my medical records from under the age of 8, and I was seen probably 6 times in emergency rooms for head injuries, and each time sent back home. So we've made progress, but I'd love to see more progress, and so I'd love to hear your answer to those questions.
Sure. So I'll start with the sort of the creation of bureaucracy issue. So I think we're hoping that this database really speaks to the public and speaks to journalists who are already covering some of these stories and really want to understand the broader context. One of the models for this site was the Washington Post database on police-involved shootings, because I think what it does is it gives context for individual incidents that may be a high-profile incident, but will quickly fade from view, and it will become unclear of what systemic change should be happening as a result. I think that this website and database will be a way for the public to hold accountable local, county, and state authorities. But in terms of creating a bureaucracy, I think what we are arguing for in part is that there should be one standard, or at least a more uniform standard across states for how those numbers are getting reported to the federal government. The federal government already has an enormous number of reporting requirements when it comes to child welfare. We're just asking to sort of focus in on this one aspect and say, wouldn't it be better if states all had to use the same criteria when they're reporting child fatalities? So I'm going to leave it there, but I think there was another question in there about the proprietary use of other databases, and maybe Emily or Sarah, you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I heard in your question was kind of the data that we're kind of collecting and using, and then a separate piece around kind of agencies in real time. How are they sharing data so that they're using that proactively to prevent serious maltreatment and fatalities? And I guess what I would say is that I don't think it's really a technology issue. It's more of a kind of a political issue. And I don't know how we solve that, but one of the things I will say that we're definitely hoping to achieve with this project is kind of just increased engagement from the public. When we put these data out, it gives kind of members of communities an opportunity to look into some of these cases where children have died, and to kind of look at what were those system involvements that occurred before. And sometimes the social workers didn't know about that, as Antonio mentioned, but maybe that will be an important kind of lever to kind of push more kind of sharing of data and accountability to government agencies for doing that.
And I think we are hoping, as I said, we have some family members with us. I think we're increasingly seeing a number of family members of victims who are trying to draw attention to these cases. Sometimes they're taking legal action, but often they're just trying to look for, attention to these issues. And we are hoping to support those efforts as well. I have a couple questions from online I want to go to. One is, what is the best argument we can make to advocate for this problem and the need for more attention on it in light of perspectives that seek to dismantle the national child welfare system? So I don't know if any of you want to speak to that. There certainly is an effort right now to, they call themselves abolitionists, to abolish the child welfare system entirely. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I'll just say that we really don't need to go back to Dickensian times. We need to have, as a community, a sense of responsibility for our children and especially when those children are not being cared for by the single people who are most responsible for them. And that's the basic principle that the system was designed to deal with, and it has enormous problems that are not easy to overcome, but to simply avoid them by saying we'll do away with the whole common responsibility is, I think, a major mistake.
And I would just add, we don't know what would happen if we were to completely abolish the system. It could very well lead to more child fatalities. Of course, the system isn't perfect, but it's the system that we have in place to strive to protect kids and families.
So one of the primary things that people argue when they say we should not focus so much on child maltreatment fatalities is that they're worried that agencies will react to this by sort of randomly removing kids from the home out of fear that a child might die. So I don't think there's good evidence that that actually happens. Removal rates may increase. We don't know if that's for children who may have been at serious risk of death. So I think that that concern is a little bit overblown. And I also think that we do want agencies to be worried about whether children might die. That's something they should, of course, be paying attention to. So I think we should not let that argument get in the way of paying attention to this issue.
Can I just add one other thing, which is I think a lot of the conversations right now around do we need a child protection, child welfare system are kind of founded in a misunderstanding of what child neglect is, and I think these data strongly speak to that. So most of the kind of the rhetoric coming from that direction is that these child neglect cases are just cases of poverty where child welfare misunderstands that. And I've repeatedly said, if that's true, I have yet to encounter an agency or a social worker who's not capable of distinguishing between serious kind of untreated substance use and poverty. But in these cases, we're giving the public an opportunity to look directly at what is being classified, what those interactions are. The vast majority of child deaths are due to neglect, just as the vast majority of investigations are due to neglect. And I assure you, if you look at these cases, you will not say, oh, these are neglect cases where we just didn't provide the material resources that were needed by those families. You will look at these cases and you will say that at multiple levels, our systems perhaps failed to properly support the family, but these are very, very severe and chronic instances of, again, substance use, severe mental illness, and family violence that has gone untreated and was ignored until a child died.
Yeah, and I would really encourage you, go to the website, click on the names of some of these children, and we have provided the source material there. So unlike the federal data, which is just going to give you a number, we are going to provide the name of the child and the story behind what happened to that child, and to the extent that it's possible, the extent that the media has reported it or it's in a fatality report, all of the history that led up to that. So again, just encourage you to look at that so you can really get a bit better understanding of what it means when a child dies, for instance, as a result of neglect. The next question we have virtually is, when thinking about prevention, is it considered a risk factor when the family has a history of CPS involvement where voluntary services have been offered over and over?
I would consider that to be a risk factor. So like Antonio, I was previously a CPS investigator, and I had a child die on an open case of mine, and it was a week after intensive family preservation services told me the family was doing great. And so I don't have a lot of confidence in our current service infrastructure to prevent these deaths. I think we have a workforce that is very undertrained and underprepared for the depth and complexity of issues that families may present with. And I think we have programs and services that have been pushed forward that have very little evidence that they actually increase child safety, but we want to look like we're doing something. So I think we should be much more circumspect about how much participation in services is a meaningful indicator that a child is safe.
Just on
From
that
our
note,
from our experience in New York, the number one indicator that a child is going to be abused or neglected, again, is the number of prior reports. And they line up in their 10s and 20s before the agency takes action. And it's when those kinds of responses by the system that lead us to the trouble that we've been in.
yeah, and just on that note, just briefly, we've talked a lot about some of the common risk factors that lead to these fatalities. But one thing that still comes to mind for me is, as mentioned, we have a serious undercount of these cases. Are we missing something from those cases that could tell us more about any other potential risk factors or any other potential systems that could or should have been involved? So hopefully this will shed light on some of those answers. And if we know what those risk factors are, then we can be in a better position to prevent these cases and support caseworkers too, to inform them of sort of the signs or symptoms or trends to look out for. Because I know from experience, they want to be supported. And when these fatalities happen, it wreaks havoc on them and the organizations that they work for.
Go ahead, we have a question from the audience. Just wait for the mic. It's coming right behind you.
Hi. Along those same lines, I think from the Commission to Eliminate Child Abuse Fatalities, that was the #1 indicator if there's been a prior referral to child welfare services. But in my experience, I've seen, this is in California, almost the more referrals there are, the more the agency kind of tends to ignore the family, because then they just say, well, this is a custody battle, or this is just a crazy family member who keeps calling. But a family member who's genuinely concerned about the welfare of a child would be crazily calling and asking for help. And so I'm wondering if any of you have any insight into that kind of dilemma of differentiating, okay, this is a serious emergency and people are really frantic, versus maybe the parents are in the middle of a custody battle, or the aunt is crazy and just keeps calling.
That's a great question. Thank you.
So,
Go ahead, Viola.
So, I'll take that. Yes, you're absolutely right that, if a family member keeps calling, sometimes people will put that aside. Also, when divorce or any type of custody matter arises, oftentimes social services will see that as a court's problem as opposed to a child welfare problem. And the trouble with that kind of thinking is we know there are a number of reasons why abuse allegations may come to light in a divorce custody situation. Maybe that first time the child or family member feels safe enough to speak up. So we have to take each of those situations seriously. I think, along those lines, it's very overwhelming. I also teach, I run the doctoral social work program, but I actually teach a lot of master's students clinical practice. And I've recently had a number of them come back who've been child welfare workers to say to me, this is overwhelming. So if you have MSW level trained social workers who are overwhelmed by what they see in the child welfare system, think back to what I said earlier, some of them don't even have college education or any of that training or that foundation. So it's really problematic. I think that we have to consider, at a point in time, I was in private practice for about 12 years straight, where the majority of my cases were foster children. And for those children, the support that they received from the child welfare system was their lifeline. But I still go back to, I don't think there is going to be one kind of panacea that's going to get us out of this situation. I think it is a multi-pronged approach. I don't think that there's one risk factor that we can identify. And I think that we have to, in my mind, I think back to many years ago, many states had laws essentially against doing sex education in the schools because they thought it would encourage sex. In reality, teen pregnancy has gone way down because as we inform people, and not just the person in crisis, but maybe the neighbor who isn't a drug user on what the signs and symptoms are, they may be in a better position to further support or look out for that child. And also if we inform people before the, like the risk of smoking initially didn't work, but when we took a different approach to it, it has reduced. So I think if we can educate everyone about the risk factors around child fatality so that everyone in society, not just the people with the problem, but everyone has their eyes and ears on it and will make that call. And when the call comes in, we find a way to implement some services or at least make some referral, even if it's not to child welfare, but some referral in the community, we have a better chance.
And I agree. I mean, as another example, kids spend 8 hours a day at school, yet teachers are not trained or informed of watching out for signs of abuse or neglect or fatalities.
And if I can just add to that just very briefly, I also think, I mean, there is no one risk factor, but the reality is we're not equipping our system and our workers with the right tools to be able to sort through complex histories on the fly, given the resource limitations that John talked about. We could be doing much better there. So that failure to respond, or the heuristic that like, oh, I've got a bunch of calls from a family member, therefore it must just be kind of custody, I think is much more a failure of the tools that the system is equipping its workforce with, as opposed to kind of the workforce itself.
Go ahead, we have a question right here.
When you hear about these cases where a child dies, but the family was known to social services, are those people ever held accountable for missing the risk factors that were present?
There have been attempts to prosecute caseworkers or supervisors in various states. In general, they, have not been very successful. There's qualified immunity. But also, I think that's the wrong answer because the reality is these caseworkers don't receive the quality of training they would need to know differently. Maybe this has gotten better since I was a caseworker, but no one ever even told me how to, what were the signs and symptoms of substance use? Like, what should I be looking for in those cases? Or, different things like, now caseworkers are supposed to, tell parents all of their rights to not let them into the home or not let them see the kids. And then if the parents use those rights, then caseworkers might just close out the case because they don't know what to do. They don't know how to gather other evidence to go to a court and say, I need to make sure I can see these kids. I need to be able to see the home because I have this other information. And so I don't think legal accountability is the right answer, but I would like some other accountability.
But I think that, I agree completely with Sarah. I think that where we don't have enough accountability is in the public reporting and notification of the community when these deaths have occurred. Because I think it does need to be a shared responsibility. It's not about pointing the blame at a particular worker or even a particular agency, but as John said, if all this data or all this information around when there have been failures, and I would say that every single time a child dies, there has been a failure in some form or another. It doesn't mean it was always preventable by one particular agency, but that is a collective failure. And for us to not be more forthcoming and transparent in releasing information when those tragedies occur, it will just ensure that they continue to occur.
We have sorry, go ahead.
I would just add there that caseworkers do not make these decisions by themselves. If they have to remove, they have to go to court and basically inform the court that this child is an imminent risk of harm. And they also have to show that they have implemented previous efforts to prevent out-of-home placement. So there's a lot of responsibility, accountability among caseworkers, I believe, in trying to protect kids and make sure that indeed these cases are presented to the courts as well.
And can I add, So I'm also trained as a forensic social worker. I have a master's of jurisprudence, in part because of the fact I was going to court so much, these types of cases. But one of the things that's happened, and it's across the country, I've heard judges say, if the caseworker had explained the situation or the risk factors in a different manner, I might have been able to make a different decision. So one of the things that when we say we don't train them, we also don't train them on how to present information in court. And I've had judges even say to me that, Dr. Von Eden, I can't rule on a risk factor. I need concrete evidence. So we have to think that interplay, without any question, the judicial system also needs to be educated themselves around these very issues of child maltreatment. But we also have to train workers to go into court to be able to accurately convey information within the context of the law so the judge can make a ruling for that family.
John, did you want to add something to that? Sorry.
Generally, in my experience, the workers are the first people to be held accountable, and they're often fired. The second group that is often held accountable, perhaps not enough accountable, but often, are the commissioners and directors of those agencies. So my predecessor in New York City, prior to him, there was a new child welfare director every 18 months because of a public response to things such as these child deaths. And you can't move a system by having somebody who can only work for an agency for 18 months at a time.
We had a question from online. It was sort of a research question, but I think also a kind of risk question, which was about matching the identities across systems. So if you have a child who has been reported, how do you sort of figure out if this is the same child who is also getting services in other ways, and what, how do these systems kind of communicate with each other?
Do you know, is that a question broadly, or is it a question about how we combined information for this database?
It's hard for me to tell because it was just emailed in, so you can take it whichever direction you want.
I guess I'll just elaborate on kind of the immediate, which is how did we kind of combine data for the purposes of the kind of the list of children you will see. And what we were struck by is in the vast majority of the media reports that we encountered, there was both an exact date of death that could be identified, and we were able to learn of the parents who were considered the perpetrators or who had been arrested. We chose not to publish the names of the adults because our focus was really about kind of naming the children who were the victims. But on the back end, that provided a great way for us to ensure deduplication. And then when we were working with state fatality reports where there may not have been names, again, we often had exact dates of death and other information within a state, so we could confirm that if there was a 1-month-old the state reported as dying due to fentanyl exposure on January 2nd, that was a child where we had no kind of other child who met that exact same kind of date and characteristics. So that's how we did that.
Other questions from the audience? I have one more from online. So one more from online is a question about the demographic breakdown of what we found. What was the racial, ethnic, or gender breakdown of what we found, and was it significantly different than what had been found from federal data that's already been reported?
I'm happy to take that one, and then Sarah, if you want to jump in. So we have not yet at this point kind of recorded and gathered information about gender or race. We've got these 2,000 cases, as I mentioned at the outset. We wanted to launch with some data that people could kind of look at and react to, but this is really just the very first stage of this project. And so as a next phase, we will be much more systematically gathering all the media articles and trying to enter quite a lot of information, both about some of those risk factors, but demographics. The one kind of demographic variable that we did look at was child age. And I think that we all went into this work knowing that we would have a biased kind of
probably somewhat unrepresentative set of cases that we were able to identify given the sources that we used. And I kind of assumed that we would have kind of a list of children that skewed heavily towards older children who were more likely to be kind of high-profile torture or homicide cases. And interestingly enough, when we looked at kind of infants and one-year-olds, our numbers line up almost exactly with the kind of the numbers that are reported in kind of NCANs and the official statistics in terms of being a proportion of the overall caseload. So as much as there's a concern that we are missing a lot of infants and young children who may die, if anything, I was overwhelmed by the number of cases that we found, in part because of substance exposure and the opioid epidemic right now.
Yeah, and I'll just add, even once we do gather the demographic data, it may not be representative because the states that share more information, where we think our count is more complete, are different, and the racial demographics of states are very different. So we may end up overcounting, for example, deaths of Hispanic children because Florida and Arizona release a lot of information. So that, I think, will be a challenge for the project going forward, but we will attempt to gather more representative cases using medical examiner reports and other sources of data that we have started but not fully integrated to date.
So I just want to close with a sort of plea to sort of the public for sort of how you can help and how you can get involved if you're interested in this. The first thing is, if there is a case that has occurred that you think should be included in our database but is not, please email us. You can go to livescutshort.org and there's contact information for us there. We are also using volunteers to help us go through fatality reports from states, and we really appreciate the efforts of the people who have helped us in that way so far. If you're interested in that sort of work and want to sort of help this project along, because there is obviously an enormous amount of information out there, we'd love to have your assistance. And also, obviously, we really want to shine a light on this issue, and so holding your political leaders and judiciary accountable at the state and local level for getting this information released. If you go to your state's page on our website and find that there's really not enough data out there and that they're not releasing things that they should be, we encourage you to get involved and get more vocal, because we really think that transparency is the key to helping address this problem. So with that, unless anyone else has anything to add, we're going to close. Thanks so much for joining us today.